foremost experts in the African diaspora on Black immigrants and African communities. We have Diana Konate, who's the Deputy Executive Director at African Communities Together Act. She works to ensure that the interests of African immigrants are considered in federal immigration policy. Prior to joining ACT, Diana worked in the House of Representatives as a legislative assistant and scheduler. While a congressional staffer, Diana also served as the president of the Congressional African Staff Association, CASA, an organization with a mission of educating the Capitol Hill community on Africa policy issue. Diana was born in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. She moved to the US at 8 years old and was raised in the Liberian community. Diana holds a JD from Michigan State University College of Law and a BA in Political Science from the Old Dominion University. So I want to welcome Diana to the stage. It's going to be a fireside chat. We're going to be very informal. We've done this, at least talking about African and Black immigrants for a long time. And so this is going to be like a chat for us. And because our friend Pius Ali has graced us here today from Portland, we're going to have him join us in this conversation because he's been very instrumental, at least in the city, in helping African diaspora migrants get settled in. So I'm excited to get on to this discussion, and I guess I'll take the mic with me, or no? I think yeah. All right, it's lovely that we can switch from over there to here. And thank you, Pius, for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, yes. You know what? Because I was able to read Diana's bio, let's get your bio, if you don't mind introducing yourselves introducing to us.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Pius Ali. I am an immigrant from Ghana, and I am a city councillor in Portland. I've been on the council since 2016. Prior to that, I was on the school board for 3 years. When I'm not working on the council, 13 years ago, I founded an organization called Portland Empowered. And what we do is we help immigrants understand how education works in the US so that they can support their kids and their families. And so we work with parents and students who are in high school. And we also work with what we call emerging leaders who are between the age of 20 and 30 in a program that we call Civic and Community Engagement Fellowship. It's 8 months long, and each of them will learn what we call soft skills. How do you find a job? How do you keep a job? How do you get involved in your community? Around policy, around community organizing, in basic things that makes your community the best that it can be. And thank you for having me.
Thank you, Pius. Always very great. And, it's great having you here. So there's been a lot of chatter about migration. We heard yesterday the debate. I don't know how many of you followed it. A lot of misconceptions, a lot of bad mischaracterization, really, of migrants. But I wanted to have, Diana give us kind of a broad stroke, or at least kind of explain to us the surge in African migrants coming to the US. How is it happening? I mean, we know it's conflict. We know it's economic challenges. We know climate change is also a part of the discussion because it's causing lots of displacement. And that is manifesting in people seeking asylum, seeking protection, seeking for a place for refuge, and coming here to our southern borders through making the journey from Africa. A lot of people are not realizing that immigration is also a Black issue. And I will never stop saying this, that a lot of our people are affected by this. And when we talk about migration and immigrants, we should be considering Black immigrants, African diaspora immigrants in the discussion. Very much so, we are erased from public opinion, even the DACA discourse, all of these discussions surrounding migration lack context, lack, I would say, just honesty and truth. And so could you give us broad strokes, kind of the primary factors that are driving this recent surge of African migrants? And could you kind of give us or distinguish the difference between migrants, refugees, asylum seekers? Because everybody's just lumping us in and saying migrants and immigrants, but everybody actually has a specific arrival time, a specific procedure. Could you give us a little bit of that?
Sure. I'll start with the second question around the distinction between the groups. And this is very broad. Sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, but an immigrant is essentially someone who has resettled in a new country, and has made a new country their home. Whereas a migrant is typically someone who is still moving, seeking to resettle in a new place. An asylum seeker and a refugee are actually defined the same way. So these are individuals who are fleeing persecution and who are looking to be protected due to that persecution. The difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker, however, here in the US, is that a refugee is applying for that protection outside of the country, and an asylum seeker is applying for that protection within the country. So when we hear about asylum seekers at our southern border, these are folks who have touched American soil and are presenting themselves to immigration officials in order to request that protection. And it's a protection that's based in international law. They have the right to ask for that protection. And so, we've seen attempts, we might get into this in the conversation, but attempts to limit people's access to asylum against international laws, against our own laws within this country. But broadly speaking, those are kind of like the categories of migration that are migrants. And then your first question was around the recent surge that we're seeing of Africans at the southern border. And I think that we are currently in a moment where it feels like the world is on fire. There's conflict everywhere, economic instability, political instability, and that's around the globe, but we're also seeing it on the African continent. And I think that what we're seeing with our southern border is typically, and which remains the case, most migration of Africans happens within the continent. That's where folks are moving within the continent from country to country. That's where most of the migration happens. But outside of that, then a large percentage of African migration typically would go to Europe. And as we've seen Europe shut its borders, European countries shut their borders, the migration routes have changed, and we're seeing more and more Africans migrating to the US to seek protection. When you look at the numbers, they have increased dramatically from, barely even 5,000 Africans at the southern border seeking asylum or seeking entry into the US from the southern border. In the last fiscal year, there were 58,000 Africans who sought asylum, who sought protection from our southern border. That's more than we allowed in through the refugee and asylum programs in the fiscal year before. So it was 58,000 in fiscal year 2023, 58,000 at our southern border, 58,000 Africans at our southern border. In the fiscal year before, fiscal year 2022, we allowed in 18,000 Africans on through asylum and refugee combined. So that's an extreme, the numbers are just really high. So we have, very high numbers of people who are Africans who are coming to the southern border. So this is now an area where we need to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to why people are coming, when they come, what kind of services, what kind of, how are they being received, and so that's some of the work that we do.
Yes, I mean, I'm an immigrant. I am of Nigerian descent. I was born in Nigeria, grew up in Italy, and moved here into the United States in the early 2000s. And so a lot of economic strife also drives people to leave their current condition and, find ways through visas or through applying. In all of these policies that we've seen in previous administrations, there've been, barriers for particularly African immigrants to apply for student visas, for all kinds of things. But what do you think are some of these major gaps in U.S. federal policy addressing immigration, especially for African immigrants and migrants, I would say?
So there are immigrants who are here in the U.S., and then there are, migrants who are seeking to come to the U.S. And I think if you just look at the data, you can see something's wrong in the system. So looking at non-immigrant visas and folks who come to the U.S. temporarily and then go back to their country. In the last fiscal year, there were 44 million people who came to the U.S. and then, temporarily through non-immigrant visas. Of those 44 million, 400,000 were Africans. So that's 1% of non-immigrant visas going to Africans. To me, it's shocking. It's shocking that there is so much travel happening around the country, around the globe, but just based on data, the Africans don't have access to the U.S. in the ways that other countries or other continents have access to the U.S. And I think that, that's definitely a barrier when African students are applying to come to the U.S. to study. They tend to be denied at a very, very high rate. Mm-hmm. Even, we see news stories every time there's like a major conference here where even scholars, researchers have hard times getting visas to come to the U.S. to participate. There have even been heads of state, diplomats who have had a hard time getting visas to come to the U.S. And this feels, from my perspective and the work that I do, it feels like it's something that's very unique to the continent, that other communities don't experience in the way that Africans do. And then, for Africans who are inside the U.S., I think that there are challenges there. Language access is an example of challenges that Africans face when they come to the U.S. With asylum, for example, since it's something that we talked about, that we're talking about these days, when folks come to the U.S. when our African brothers and sisters are coming to the U.S. Seeking asylum, one of the first things that they have to do before they can even start that process is find somewhere to live, put food on the table, have access to work authorization. But a lot of times they don't even, they're not able to even get that access to work authorization because the asylum process requires that you wait a certain amount of time, 180 days, before applying for your work authorization. And for our communities, that tends to be a problem because whereas some other communities come with family in the U.S., they know people here, they have families here, they have friends here. A lot of times, the communities that we're seeing coming from the borders don't have that. So they are at a disadvantage in, kind of even starting. And then once they do, if they are able to get themselves settled, then finding an attorney can be very hard. Sharing a lot of the traumatic experiences that people have gone through, can be very hard. So just the whole process itself tends to be a very difficult process, just generally. But I think, there are specific other challenges as it relates to Africans.
Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, my organization discussed welcoming about 30,000 refugees from the Congo. And I think we can all understand how all of these conversations are tied between the critical minerals, the migration, displacement, and everything that is happening. And so because we have this explosion of people that we have to help out, it means that we have to pay closer attention to Africa and what's going on and the needs of the continent. We've seen that the African diaspora, the reason why I mentioned the 30,000 Congolese folks that are getting ready to come here is because there's a new program with the State Department called the Welcome Corps, which specifically is, they have it for different communities, but they're trying to help these folks within the African diaspora because they already, talking to folks who've already been here for a long time, will give them that language access, that cultural knowledge of being here, of having been here and having an experience of back home. So I wanted to kind of, and I'm going to bring you into this. How do you see the African diaspora getting involved, and how have the communities and families been impacted when it comes to African migrants? We've been seeing it for the last couple of weeks, just the news on, pets being eaten, pets disappearing. We all know that it's just rhetoric and it's just negative, made to paint immigrants in a negative light. But I would like to know how the African diaspora has been able to respond to the call to help our brothers and sisters that are trying to come. I know as, part of the city of Portland, initially when some of our people started coming in, you were very responsive and very helpful in reception of migrants. Can you talk to us a little bit about how, I know that this recent experience with especially Texas Governor Abbott busing people from one city to the other happening, trying to leverage. During your time as part of the city of Portland, how were you able to assist the newcomers? If you could talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Thank you very much. So historically, Portland have been a city, or as Maine, the state of Maine, and Portland have been a place that have taken resettlements, but that was mostly refugees. And I think my friend Anna already explained what the two are. When the refugees come, they come with government support already, because the government processed them before they even travel to the US. And we have had before the Somalis and Southern Sudanese, we've had Ethiopians, we've had people that came from the Balkans during the Clinton administration. If you go way back, we had Armenians, we had Jewish immigrants, Italian immigrants. So Portland is used to having immigrants settle in Portland. Maine is one of the whitest states in the Union. So, and we are also not a border town. A few years ago, there was a governor who literally, he can claim that the former president may have taken some of his rhetoric from these governors' playbook. His name is Governor LePage, and he has said all sort of awful things about immigrants, about Black people, and about everybody that doesn't look or agree with him. When he was there in Maine, you can literally arrive in Maine a couple of years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, with a visa, and we will give you a state ID. We will give you a license or something like that. When he got into power, he changed all of that. And there's one thing that he changed, and my city said no, was that the state will not allow immigrants to access the support that we give people who need help, like GA, General Assistant, for them to pay for rent. And we went back and forth with him. And then the then mayor in my city we put something on the ballot, which passed, that allows for people within that 180 days to be given some kind of like support with housing and other. They don't get everything that refugees or residents do get, but they get some support. And when the southern border became an issue in 2019, literally, we were in the middle of a city council meeting, a subcommittee, Health and Human Service Committee, discussing what to do with the new arrivals, when the city manager had a phone call that said that there is masses of people on their way coming from the border, and they're coming towards Portland. And the council then directed the city manager and said that let's find a way to accommodate them, because it was during the President Trump's time. And so we opened our we had a basketball hall that is strictly for sports. We turned that into some sort of like a shelter where we put people. And since then, many African migrants have come to Portland. Some of them do stay. Some of them, after a couple of months or a year or so, once they got they filed for their asylum and they've started getting the support and their feet is getting strong, they find somewhere else to go. But we still have people who how do we call it? We build a shelter, a new shelter, because we also have like a homeless the explosion. We have the number of homeless going up. And then we also have a shelter that is specifically for migrants who are single. Most of them are men, and we have a family shelter. Our social services literally is catering to about 90% African migrants.
That's great. I mean, that you've been able to do this work. I mean, I know that in New York, Diana, ACT has been very, very busy helping folks that are being bused from Texas. So can you give us a little insight on what ACT has been able to do to mobilize support for the recent arrivals?
Yeah, so we in our New York chapter have seen an influx in arriving migrants, particularly Africans, and we have been active with other African orgs on the ground, mosques. I really think that as the African diaspora here in the U.S., we have really come together to really support the groups of folks who are newly arriving. And a lot of it has been with kind of like rapid response, finding a lot, we've seen a lot of mosques housing migrants. We have seen organizations supporting with providing culturally appropriate foods for people. Um, um, we are able to provide support, when folks are bused to these cities. One of the first things that they have to do is file for a change of address with USCIS, so that when their asylum uh, case moves forward, that USCIS is able to contact them and communicate with them. So these are kind of some of the first things that people need to do when they arrive. But outside of that, we have built a committee of these recent asylum seekers. We have really gotten them engaged in a lot of advocacy in New York. One of the things that they are currently fighting for is the right to shelter in New York. Mayor Adams has sought to do away with access to shelter in the city of New York, and so these migrants who have just recently arrived have been fighting for that right to shelter. In addition to that, we have folks who are fighting for TPS protection, temporary protected status, protection for Congolese immigrants and migrants who are here in the U.S. And for folks who are not familiar with TPS, temporary protected status is a form of humanitarian protection that the U.S. government will give to a country when the conditions in that country are unsafe for people to be returned to that country. So currently there are 5 African countries with TPS: Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, Cameroon, and Ethiopia, given the ongoing armed conflicts in those countries. And the asylum seekers that we have in New York, we also have some members in our other chapters and throughout the country who are also fighting for this, but those arriving migrants are fighting for protection, TPS protection for the Congolese community. Not just the Congolese community, the Malian community. Mali has been experiencing armed conflict for the past decade in that country. These are some of the activities that our membership and the arriving migrants have been a part of.
Thank you, Diana. And I know that ACT was also very successful in bringing the Liberian community together to receive DED. Can you tell us a little bit about, what did it take to get the commitment from the Liberian community to advocate to get DED?
It was tough. And let me give some background on DED. So DED is similar to TPS in that it's a form of protection that the U.S. government will give to a country, or nationals from a particular country. And however, the difference between the two is that TPS is given by the Secretary of DHS, and DED is a protection that's given directly from the president. So Liberia has had some form of protection since 1991, starting off with TPS protection. And in fact, I came to the US in 1991, and that is how my family was protected, through TPS for Liberia. And so TPS, Liberia has had some form of protection. Under the Trump administration, when former President Trump came into office, he canceled that protection. Liberians who had been protected for decades were about to lose their status and become undocumented in this country. We sued the government over that termination, and getting the Liberian community to understand, and and I shouldn't say it was just the work that we did. There has been a lot of advocacy going on within the Liberian community, for decades. I think that the Liberian community is one of the communities within the African community that have been very politically active, and so they were kind of used to the advocacy. But when it came to DED, it was a challenge to get people to, for lack of a better term, out themselves about their status and about the fact that they were here on, this temporary status, and they were about to lose that status. What does it mean if you have your work authorization through DED and it's about to be terminated, and in a few months you're about to be undocumented? Do you want to put yourself in the media in a scenario like that? But folks did realize that at the end of the day, this is how we fight for our rights. Nothing will be given to us unless we demand it and unless we're willing to fight for it. So, we sued the administration. The day of our hearing for a preliminary injunction, mysteriously, the administration turned course, shifted course, and extended DED for an additional, I believe it was 18 months. And in the extension, when Trump extended it that time, he said that it was to give Congress an opportunity to come up with a more permanent solution instead of DED. So, we took that as a victory. That lawsuit allowed us to, get another DED extension. And during that time, we really, hit the ground running. We had our members talking to their members of Congress. We had folks talking to the media about DED and what DED protection meant for them. And that created the environment where Congress was able to work together to ultimately pass a green card program for the Liberian community. The first green card program that came, through Congress in decades. And it allowed thousands of Liberians to be able to apply for green cards. And none of that would have happened without the advocacy of the Liberian community and people willing to put themselves out there and talk about their status and talk about what taking away that status would mean, for them, for their families, for their community. And we were ultimately able to not just get DED extended, but ultimately get green cards out of Congress, signed by President Trump.
Yep. Great work. Very proud. I mean, talk about never going back, right? Again, we're nonpartisan here. I wanted to bring back Pius to kind of talk a little bit about what specific changes do you think, folks that are recently coming always go through language barrier issues. Sometimes there's been so much trauma in the refugee progress that mental health services are, lackluster, unfortunately. What specific changes in terms of providing social services for African migrants do you think are relevant as you've done it within your city? What do you think are immediate needs that folks should be thinking about, especially when we're talking about it in an African diaspora context? For example, I know that there are large communities of Nigerians, for example, in Texas. And I know that there we try to organize or at least try to help folks that are recently coming. But is there a mechanism or at least something that you think could be advocated for in terms of making, welcoming African diaspora refugees a little bit better. I want to share this experience with you guys. I was going to El Paso, and there was a food drive for migrants. And there were also Senegalese migrants. And the kind of food that they were going to give had pork. We're Africans. We don't, I mean, generally, most of us don't eat pork. But even in terms of knowing culturally what can be given, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, language-wise, I already know it's difficult. But what do you think are some of the things that we can advocate better, some changes that you think will help us do a better job at welcoming our people coming?
Thank you very much. I think from the municipal government perspective, you need to talk to the city government. Everything that I said the city of Portland have done, the city did not do it by itself. We partner with communities. For example, we have an organization that is run by non-African immigrants, one of the biggest organizations in the state that focuses on getting immigrants to understand how finance works in the US, right? It's called Prosperity Me. And then we have another one that works with women to get them to understand how they can live in the US and what they can do to support themselves. And then we have a big umbrella organization called Main Immigrant Rights Coalition. What they do is they advocate both at city and then at the state. When the migrants arrived in 2019, even though MERC, Main Immigrant Rights Coalition, was not structured to be a service provider, they immediately work with the city to be the ones that are running the, how do we call it, the shelter, the city's shelter, the huge settlement shelter that we had. And they work with other organizations which are not immigrant-led, but they serve mostly immigrants to put things in place. We actually have an organization that looks into food. When the migrants were put in shelters, there's a woman from Congo and her husband from Nigeria. They immediately started an organization that look at the type of food that the shelters give out. And then they work with them as consultants. And now they have their own food cart where people go to them to get appropriate culture food. Our city have a program, like an office called Office of Economic Opportunities, where we work with immigrants. And so in all of these spaces, including my own organization that I mentioned, in all of these spaces, conversations happen on what are the appropriate food, what are culturally responsive food, how to have conversations with immigrants so that it will be a conversation that they will understand and they will be in charge of the conversation because it's done in their language. We do all of that, and that is the best way. When there is we had the first huge influx of migrants, then the city council authorized the city manager. He brought an idea because there's a lot of people in the greater Portland area, they don't live in our city, that have said that, how can we help? So the city council authorized the city manager, and we took donation from people. We raised almost $1 million. Wow. And we gave that money to, service providers. We asked community leaders and community-led organizations to apply and say, this is what we're going to use the money, and we gave it out. So things like that, if your city is not doing it, you can advocate and ask them to do it. And also, I know that in most of our communities, starting organizations and running them is already there. But if we don't, we should encourage community members who have the skills and the ability to start organizations, because then you become a bridge between the municipal government, the state government, and the people, because the government will always work the way governments work, right? There need to be someone who can interpret and say to the government that this thing is not helpful to this community. This is what you need to do to meet the need of, because each community is different.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I know that Nigerian jollof is better than Ghanaian.
Oh, that is a conflict. That is a conflict I don't want to go into.
Of course, we're different communities.
That is true. But it depends on who is making the jollof, though.
Absolutely.
The jollof, yeah.
It's Nigerians always better. But anyways, I wanted to bring it back to Diana and kind of give us on federal implications, right? Like, what are the broader implications of U.S. immigration on U.S.-Africa relations? Like, I feel that we don't often talk about what the African governments should be doing to do better. Yes, don't have conflict. That's not enough for them. But what can African governments or what can folks do to improve relations in terms of coordination for migrants, visa issuance? Again, I'm Nigerian, so I'm going to bring Nigeria up. I have cousins who have been denied visas with sponsors, with money. What can we do to make it better?
I mean, so as far as what governments, African governments can do, I think just being aware of, you know, what's happening with their diasporas here in the US. I think that, you know, with a lot of the advocacy that we do, we will oftentimes reach out to the embassies here and inform them about the advocacy that we're doing and, you know, explain why we're doing it, why it would benefit the diaspora here. And, you know, it's not always that we can get their affirmative support, but at least the goal is to not get them blocking what we're trying to do. And, you know, we've seen instances of, so for example, with TPS, if TPS is given because of a natural disaster, the government itself has to ask for TPS. So in the circumstances, this is in an African country, but for example, Pakistan, when there was some flooding in that country a few years ago, you know, advocacy groups were really trying to get the government to make the ask because that was required for the country to be for Pakistanis here in the US to be protected. And it was very difficult for them to get the government to agree. And partly, you know, it's not that the governments don't want to help their diaspora. Sometimes they just don't understand what these you know, benefits are. You know, it's my understanding that there was some conversations about, oh, well, if we have TPS, is that going to impact our ability to get loans? You know, because essentially you're saying that the country is not safe for the U.S. to return people to. So, you know, just being aware, governments being in communication with their diasporas, hearing from their diaspora. I know that, you know, depending on what countries we're talking about, sometimes it's, in some instances, is more difficult than others. But, you know, we have instances where it's been successful. So, for example, with the Liberia example, we were able to work with, when the Green Card program was implemented, we were having issues because it was the middle of the COVID epidemic. People couldn't travel. People couldn't, you know, get their passports from the embassy. It was just a real mess. But we were able to work with the Liberian embassy around documents that that could be used outside of maybe a passport that would show that someone was actually a Liberian national in order for them to benefit from this Green Card program. So that those are ways that governments can be helpful. You know, I think another thing is that just always having the best interests of your people and your diaspora in mind. So when you are going to, negotiate whatever it is you all are negotiating, whether it's trade, whether it's, whatever diplomatic conversations are happening, always thinking about the people. Again, sometimes it's easier for some countries versus others. But I think that that's very helpful in our advocacy here. But then, for folks here, I think just being engaged in advocacy. I think that, we're as an African, as the African community, I think we're becoming more politically active. Some communities have been more politically active than others, but I think as a whole, we are, becoming more politically active, more politically engaged. And I think that that's what we really need to see the types of changes that we want to see. I think that helps us be more influential in whether it's, trade policy, whether it's development, migration, whatever it is. People have to see that we as a diaspora are engaged and do care about these issues and have something to say.
Absolutely.
May I add to that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned politically because in 2013, when I got elected to Board of Education, there's only few Africans who are in elected office. As a matter of fact, when NPR talked to me, they gave me the list of people and said that this is other Africans. And they said, is it okay if we connect you to them? Now, I wouldn't say there are hundreds, but there are tens of Africans who are in elected office, from school boards, city council, county commissioners, all the way to state legislatures. We even have some in Congress. So I think you guys should see us as a resource in some of the work that you do when you are advocating. For example, our congressional delegates in Maine. If I email them and I say, may I sit with you and talk about something, there's no way they're going to say no. Both the Republicans and the Democrats and the independents, they would meet with me. And when I'm going, I'm not just going to go by myself. When I got elected, it was just me. Now we have, in my city alone, we have 5. We're going to have like 2 more this year. So there's going to be 7 Africans who are in elected office: school board, city council, and then the state legislature. And then across the state, there's about 8 Africans who are in elected office. So if 8 of us reach out to our congressional delegates and say, can we meet with you? Even if they don't like me because what I have said in the past, they're not going to not like the 7 others. They will meet with us and we can bring the issues that you are advocating to them. And there are others in other states. So I think about that.
Yeah. I think one of the messages that I would like to share with folks is that we have 55 days. Again, this is a nonpartisan message. We have 55 days. So if you're not registered to vote, please make sure you're registered. 411.org is the website to make sure that your registration is up to date. Make sure you have that. And then on November 5th, make sure you head to the polls. If you want to do that before, that's also very welcome. Early voters are the best, because all of these policies and all of these things, migration, conflict, displacement, at the end of the day, it's an entity, a country, a government that, is representative of our participation. And if we're not participating, then decisions are going to be made without our consent, without our informed, input. And so, yes, we're talking about migrants. Yes, we're talking about the African diaspora, but this here is home. So I just want to reiterate that as we look forward to the next panel, which is going to be addressing African free trade and continental trade agreement and AGOA and very nice business focused things. But migration and immigration is also part of our being here and living here and seeing our brothers and sisters coming from other places that require our cultural knowledge to welcome them in a better way than they've been welcomed so far. And so I am very thankful to my panelists. Thank you so much, Diana, for your presentation and your information. We do have Q&A, so if folks want to ask, we have time for 3 questions. We have 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5.
All right. Thanks for the speaking. And okay, so my question. So Diana, you mentioned about the diplomats also got denied, right, for the visa issues. So what is the main reason? I think that the diplomat's status has to be guaranteed by the UN Charter, right? So why this thing happened? Is it simply because of racism or some of the religion or political crime? And also you mentioned about some of the asylum seekers are there and then you want to get the support from the embassy, right? But usually those asylum seekers and the part of those refugees may be critical, right, against the home country. So in that case, how would you like to reconcile this kind of relationship?
Yeah. So with the diplomats, I think, so consular officers don't necessarily state why an application is being denied. You know, we don't always have a clear understanding of what it is, but, you know, I've had people at State Department say to me, oh, well, you know, we think that, you know, this community is gonna overstay. And to me, I feel as though that is a bit of racism, you know, the thinking that, oh, Africa sucks. And so everybody from Africa is trying to come to America. And so we can't give them visas because, you know, as soon as we give them the opportunity to come here, all of Africa is going to be in America. I think that is a racist thought. And I think that that is why a lot of the times Africans are not able to access our immigration system is because of it, just broadly speaking, that's what it is. And that's really unfortunate because you know, there's a lot that's lost. You know, if you even just think about like the research, for example, us exchanging ideas and we're not able, Africans aren't able to really be a part of, you know, those conversations if they're not here. So that's the diplomats. And then you had a question about asylum. Yeah. So you know, sometimes with asylum, yes, definitely, because you're saying I'm being persecuted. So there's no real support that the governments are going to give. But sometimes with TPS particularly, you are saying that the conditions in that country are such that people cannot go back. And there have been instances where governments are more than happy to say, yes, you know, the conditions we're working on, you know, whatever problems we have right now. But in the meantime, we would like for the U.S. to provide protection to our diaspora. And sometimes it's depending on how big the diaspora is, sometimes it's in the interest of the country because of the remittances that go back. So a lot of the times countries want their diaspora to stay in the US, to work in the US, and to be able to send money back and support families back home. So in the case of asylum, it's a little different, but there are other instances where governments. And I'll try to be quick, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, everybody. My name is Bakri Tanja. I am very familiar with, you know, the issue of immigration because I have been doing it for more than 20 years, advocacy at city, state, and federal level. And thank you, Diana, Nneka, and Brother Ali for your presentation. So I have a lot to say, but for the interest of time, I will try to limit myself. The first thing I would like to raise is the issue of detention. We have many asylum seekers in detention living in harsh conditions. So Diana, what is your assessment of the situation? And what would you recommend in terms of advocacy strategy to improve that situation? The second, then a quick comment about the relationship between the diaspora and African government. I think what if there is a healthy, constructive relationships between the diaspora and the continent, it will be a win-win situation. Because we here, as American citizens from the continent, we have a powerful voice to advocate for them. The example is what your brother just said. If you have a possibility to request a meeting with a congressional a delegation to raise not only issues affecting the diaspora, we can also raise issues affecting the continent in a very effective manner. So I stop here. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you for the work that you're doing on immigration and migration. Just to touch quickly on detention, yes, I mean, there are a lot of our community members who are currently in detention. And the problem with immigration detention is oftentimes people are put into immigration detention not because they've done anything, but just waiting for an immigration date. And so, I mean, to me, that seems outrageous that you just have people in cells and cages just because they're waiting for a court date, not because they've done, something, they're a threat to society, just because they're an immigrant, they're a migrant, waiting for a court date. That makes absolutely no sense to me. And then when people are, in prison, essentially waiting for a court date to adjudicate their claim, their request for asylum, the conditions in those detention centers are just deplorable. You have people who aren't given an opportunity to pray. They don't have space to pray. They're not given access to attorneys to help them with their cases. They're not given access to their family. There is abuse going on. It's horrible to think that people who have escaped persecution from their own country and who have come to the US asking for protection are then put into these situations where they're further abused. So detention is, a serious issue. I think that we don't talk about it enough. People don't understand why people are in immigration detention. I think a lot of the times people think detention and they're like, oh, they must have done something. No, that's not the case. People are just in detention because they're waiting for, some type of court case, and there's yeah. So, anyways, I will stop there.
I just want to add one thing, and I think detention is bad as it is, but if I compare it to what's going on in terms of how people are being detained in close to the Mediterranean, Libya, all of these folks are being treated in a way that I just cannot even fathom that these are people that are fleeing from refuge, going back in a situation that is 10 times worse than what they came from. And at the southern border, you're dealing with even gangs at this point, kidnappings, extortions. After you've gone through that, you're once again detained in a center. I mean, it's unconscionable that women, children are being put through this. When we were talking about child separation and kids in cages, these are the people we're talking about, people being detained for waiting to have their stuff processed. But anyway, that was just my comment.
Thank you, everybody, for the conversation. My name is Chime Sonia. I'm the founder of an organization called Nigerian Mental Health. I'm also a former commissioner on the DC Commission on African Affairs. And so I was really poignant by your comment about the elections and elected officials and the connection. And so I have two questions, but first on this point, about advocacy. And I'm sure in African communities, we all don't know who the elected officials are. And I think that there's a dearth of civic engagement within our community. I know African Communities Together is there. There's an organization, I'm based in Chicago now, called the United African Organization, UAO, that I just talked with. And I'm not sure if UAO and African Communities Together talk a lot. I'm not sure about, we're talking about diaspora power. We have a multitude of new media organizations from OK Africa to Amplify Africa. We even have centers like Africa Center. And I always wonder, right, not only do we not know who we are, we're not working together. And we can see that when we do work together, we can get extensions on from the administration and things like that, but we're not. And that means there's a dearth of power. So I'm not putting it in the hands of the elected officials to say you can do more, but you're there for a purpose. And I'm not putting on African Communities Together because you guys are doing the work. But if you're at the forefront, those who have much power have much responsibility to galvanize or organize and build those bridges. So what can we do to connect those dots in order to build power for us? I think that's very important. The second question I have is, I wrote it down. It's interesting to be in a conversation like this or a conversation around migration and the focus be on Africans or Black folks. Usually in popular conversation is not. I'm sorry if this has been discussed earlier, I came a little late. Usually when we're thinking about migration, we're thinking about Latin America. We're thinking about Venezuela, what's going on right now, because that's where we have the highest surge. And what that means is because the complexion doesn't necessarily look like what's in this room, when Black folks have discussions around immigration, it's those people that look like them are taking our jobs, because we're thinking about Black individuals as Black and brown people as those who are homeless and things like that. If you look at statistics in most urban cities, there are actually folks that look like more in this room. And so that becomes a huge divide about who people vote for. That becomes a huge divide about what kind of services you elect or you try to support. So how does this come up in your work now in terms of, do you convince individuals who are Black that this is a problem that they should care about because they're an important part of this constituency, right? Does that not come up? And how do we win that conversation, which I think is a very pressing conversation, especially as we in the race to November?
We're going to take this last question and then it's okay.
You have 10 questions.
Thank you.
We have two, but if we can make them 1 minute each, that would be helpful. But before that, Chime, immigration is a Black issue. Just wanted to add that.
She began with saying that.
Yeah. Go ahead, Courtney.
Thanks. I'm Courtney. I'm a first-year graduate candidate at Georgetown University in the new Master's in International Migration and Refugee Studies, and I was so excited for this conversation. I have a couple questions. You said that some communities are more active than others, and I'm just wondering why that is. Is it just a numbers game? Is it about interest in different sectors? And then another question is, as someone who's very new to this, who is doing the largest lobbying at the top levels in terms of increasing visas for African migrants?
My question is, there's a lot of churches, faith-based places of worship, temples, mosques that are in disuse in the United States because of various reasons. And there's a lot of ministries and various faith-based organizations doing a lot of work in terms of outward investment. What steps can be taken to perhaps redirect this capital that's being sent outwards to domestically? Can we renovate, restructure these existing places of worship that are in disuse into shelters, community spaces, where not only is the space there for, immigrants to practice their faith, right, in a safe space, but to bring together the entire community? Is that possible? And can we make that happen in terms of having the church, faith-based organizations and faith-based aid groups working in conjunction to make community spaces here?
And then, do you still have your question? Okay, great.
Question. I'm trying to. I wish I had a notepad to write them down. But I mean, the last question is what I remember. Yeah, I mean, definitely. I don't see why not, you know, have that, because our faith-based organizations are, you know, integral to a lot of our daily lives, and particularly in the African community. A lot of us are, you know, very much involved with our faith, and it's something that is that we value very deeply. And so, you know, figuring out a way to have those organizations come together and create even more of more than just a place where people go to worship. And I think you are seeing that in New York specifically. With the recent arriving migrants, you know, we have a lot of mosques and a lot of imams who have come and really supported these communities. You know, who are bringing people to sleep in their mosques. You know, supporting people with food, supporting people with just whatever they need, to be honest. But those they don't have the resources to do that. A lot of people are taking money out of their own pockets to be able to do this work. So, you know, if there was, you know, a way for works to come together and create more, that would be great.
May I add to that? I know that you mentioned that in the US, a lot of people don't go to churches and these things. So you're talking about those spaces. As you know, real estate is a big business in the US. So even though those churches are empty, the structure that used to hold that church still belongs to someone, and they will not willingly take and give it out for free. Recently, in I think Syracuse, New York, or Albany, New York, a Muslim group purchased a church, an old church. It was not given to them for free. They purchased it, and they're going to turn it into a mosque. It became an issue in the community that why do you have to sell a church to Muslims? Something to think about. Yeah.
The question about like organizations kind of you know, coming together to build more power within African communities, and I think we are attempting to do that. There is a group called the African Immigrant Legislative Forum, which, you know, we all are a part of, and it's a collection of African organizations, African serving organizations around the country that comes together once a month to talk about immigration policy and how it impacts our communities. And this is a space where organizations like UAO and the folks there come learn about what's happening at the federal level, and where we try to mobilize ourselves when things need to happen. So, you know, right now, for example, ACT is working on TPS for the DRC and TPS for Mali. So one of the first places that we'll go is ALEF to talk about our advocacy and to get groups involved in it. To as Paya said, you know, can you reach out to your member of Congress and ask them to sign on to this congressional letter? Can you, you know, have your membership go to and do lobby visits? Can you guys do this? Can you guys do that? So I think that you know, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, but it is happening. And you know, we are slowly connecting to each other, learning about what each of us are doing around the country, learning about challenges, and working to support each other in the work that we're doing.
Thank you.
And then you asked about the different communities being politically involved. I think, you know, some of it is, it just depends. Like, you know, I think about the Nigerian community. I think for that community, there's a large number of Nigerians in the US. You know, you have folks who are, you know, highly educated, like business leaders, folks who have come to the U.S. to study, anyways, to work. And so because the numbers are so large, I think in that instance, that's an example of the political power in one community. We have the Somali community. They tend to have a lot of elected officials throughout the country, including one in Congress. And that community isn't necessarily maybe as large as the Nigerian community, but I think that they've really tapped into something and have really been able to do a lot for their community. You have the Liberian community, the Sudanese community. The Sudanese community, we've seen with the recent war in that country, they have really they've organized themselves in a way that we hadn't seen it here, but we did see it in Sudan. And so I think they have a tradition of that. And so now we're seeing them really take hold of the issue of the war and really fighting for the U.S. to do more. So I think like with every community, I say all that to say, with every community, it's kind of different. But we want African communities together. We are a Pan-African organization, and we want Africans to come together as Africans and not necessarily solely as our individual community, nationalities, ethnic groups, tribes. And so with the advocacy that we do, you'll see our Sudanese members coming out and calling for TPS for Mali. Our Malians coming out and calling for TPS for the DRC, because we realize that we're in this all together and we're trying to build that type of culture with the African community in the US. Other questions? I'm so sorry.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Diana, to cut you short. We're actually out of time. We have our last panel on the AGOA and African Continental Trade Agreement. We are going to meet back into the room in 5 minutes. If you want to grab a water, go to the restroom and come back so that we can close out with the last panel. Thank you.
Good job, guys.
Yeah.